Welcome to the Dirt on Growing, where we don't just plant seeds, we plant ideas that challenge the norm. I'm your host, Brandon Rust from Full Crop Sciences, and this is the podcast where living soil meets real science. From worm castings to bottled nutrients, microbial inoculants, and chemical pesticides, we're here to question the trends, break down the data, and empower your grow. It's time to think deeper and grow better.
Welcome to the Dirt on Growing podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Rust. And today we are going to talk about how you can boost crop yield in just 3 minutes a day. So what if I told you that just spending 3 minutes a day with your plants could boost yields? And you're probably wondering how. And it's by stopping problems before they start and spread, which can save you tons of money in the long run and increase your production and quality. You don't need new equipment. You don't need expensive additives to do this. You just need you and your plants and 3 focused minutes. So I'm going to break it down exactly what I mean by how spending 3 minutes a day can boost your harvest. So the first thing that I want to talk about is insect scouting. So bugs. Most growers lose yield not because of nutrition or lighting, but because they miss the early signs of pest pressure. So with just 30 to 60 seconds a day, a few flip of the leaves, scanning stems, looking for honeydew, looking for different marks or discoloration, spotting an aphid colony today means you can stop it before it explodes. So insect scouting is really, really important. It's something that you should have in your SOPs for integrated pest management. And what this typically looks like is just looking over the plant thoroughly, looking at the stems, looking at the undersides of the leaves, looking at the tops of the leaves, and also looking at your media for any type of signs of things like discoloration, spotting, any physical insects themselves. And the reason why you want to do this is just because preventative measures are so much better than trying to go to war and treat something. You're going to spend exponentially more money on treatment, but if you can catch something early, you can mitigate further spread, given that you have the right tools to do so. But catching anything early is the trick. And even when you do use preventative measures, it doesn't necessarily mean everything is going to be perfect 100% of the time. So you can get high insect pressure, and that can build if you're not taking just a minute a day. And if you're in a situation where it's a small grow, it's really easy. You can just go around, you can check certain sites. It doesn't take a lot of time. If you're in a situation where you're at a larger scale, just taking that minute once a day and looking at different areas of the room and checking things over, by the end of the week, you've looked at, the majority of that space in different selective locations, so you can have an overall kind of view of what that insect pressure might be if you have any. So insect scouting, there's a couple of different things that you can do. You can do just visual cues, looking at the things that I just talked about. You can also take something like a plain white piece. Oh, camera just dropped. Sorry about that. You can take a plain white piece of paper like this, and you can put it underneath your canopy or your leaves, and you can shake. And if you get anything that looks like little spots, you can take a microscope and look at that. Also, traps work really well also to be able to identify different types of pests. Next, it would be looking at nutrients. So most growers, most deficiencies announce themselves if you're paying attention. So things like yellowing from the bottoms up, which could be nitrogen deficiency, or yellowing on the edges, which could be potassium deficiency, interveinal chlorosis, which could be a sign of magnesium deficiency, purpling stems, which could be a sign of phosphorus deficiency, There's other cases where purpling stems could be a symptom of something else. But by simply comparing new growth to old growth, you can catch issues before they become systemic, and you can catch them before they spread and really become an issue. And so preventative maintenance, again, if you have the ability to do preventative maintenance and look at things like soil testing, typically you won't run into those issues. But if you're able to have a really good understanding of the visual cues that are associated with different type of nutrient deficiencies, toxicities, or even antagonisms, if you know those, you can look at your plants and determine if some type of action needs to be taken. In the case of something like interveinal chlorosis, that's typically a sign of magnesium deficiency. You could spray Epsom salt. In the case of something like where you have all of the outer edges of your leaf sets are burning, kind of look like they're burning or they're dying, and you might have some purpling on the leaf petioles or maybe on the stems, that's a really strong indication that you need more potassium. And you could add something like potassium humate, potassium sulfate. You could add something like Agsil 16, which is potassium silica, to take those corrective measures. But the biggest takeaway is that going in there and taking a minute just to look at the new growth, look around and see if there's anything happening. And if you see and notice something that's abnormal or that's changing rapidly, to take those measures to correct that, so that way it doesn't further spread and you don't lose any of your yield or quality. So those are two different things that you can do. Also, you should also take a couple of minutes just to make sure that your environmental parameters are on point. Even if you have automation set up, whether it's a tent or it's a shed grow or it's a commercial facility, it's always beneficial to just take 1 minute to go and see what your environmental parameters are. Not just look at your instruments, but actually have a meter, let's say like a digital thermometer, digital CO2 reader, something that you can do comparative analysis against what is in there if you have anything. But just maintaining proper environmental parameters and checking on those daily for a couple minutes just to make sure everything's functioning, that'll prevent issues, because you can catch things early on. And a good example of this is I've had people that have reached out to me and they've said, hey, my timer accidentally was left on for the last 48 hours and I'm in the 4th week of flower. What should I do? And it's like catching things like that early, or if you're going in and checking every day, you can catch those, and something like that may not be a big deal if it's only been on for an extra 24 hours or 48 hours. But let's say it goes an additional week and your plants start to re-veg, it could mess up your harvests. So just being thorough and taking a couple of minutes a day to check on these different things can greatly increase your production and your quality. And it's because what you're wanting to do is you're not just wanting to address one thing. It's when you collectively are looking at all of the things as a system and looking at things holistically that you can really start to improve upon the building blocks that you already have in place. So, environment is where most people lose yield, and a lot of people don't even know it. Temperatures, humidity, CO2, airflow, they should all be in that kind of Goldilocks zone. Now, you don't need, complete data logs. You don't need, crazy, things to control them. Just a quick head check, really. I mean, if you're staying within certain parameters, you should be okay for the most part. Even though I know a lot of people want to really dial things in, that's awesome. And I'm the same way. But I know that if I'm within certain parameters, and as long as those are, functioning within that range, things are usually gonna be okay. So, again, going back to handheld checks, if you are automated, check those machines, and it just takes a couple of minutes. Make sure that they're within a certain range, so that way your data logs are good if you're taking data. Leaves should dance slightly in the breeze. You don't want massive airflow blasting on things, as it causes additional stress. So making sure that things like your airflow is good but not too powerful. Checking on your lights and making sure that you don't need to decrease them, if it looks like you're having some type of issue at the top of your canopy. Checking on things like your VPD. These just take a couple of minutes every single day, and they will greatly improve your skill set as a grower. 30 seconds is all it takes. Confirm your zone the different growing zones are equal. Take your little handheld thing if you don't have, move around your sensor if you have one. Doing things like that, small things, can make a big difference in the long run. And then the last thing that I really wanted to touch on is media moisture. So checking media for, root hair extremes, if it's too wet, if it's too dry. It's super, super easy to go in there and check, to pick up a pot. I mean, obviously, if you're in a bed, you're not gonna be able to pick that up. But if you're in cocoa, if you're in rock wool, check on your media. It only takes a couple of seconds, to go in there and check throughout the day to make sure that everything is firing optimally, or that way you're not oversaturating your plants, or you're not underfeeding them. Just taking a couple of seconds a day to really check in on how much you should be watering is super important. And I see this mistake made so much, because especially when people are new, they might not know how much water they need. And then, the amount of water is also contingent on your environmental parameters, because if it's drier in the environment, the water is going to dry out from that media faster. So that's why I correlated all of these things together. Environment and moisture meter are going to change depending on the different factors. If you've got more moisture from the media, then your environmental parameters will change. So those things are both factors that are correlated, that you should be taking a little bit of time to look at whenever you're in your grow room and you're feeding, or whatever it is you might be doing. And one of the things that you can also do is just journal. Create a log, a handwritten log that says, this is how much water I added, this is how long it took for the media to completely dry out. And look at your notes and adjust the times that you need to feed, or adjust your lighting, or adjust your airflow based off of the small improvements that you see holistically by doing this approach. So that is kind of my spiel on maximizing yield and quality with just 3 minutes a day. It really comes to just being diligent about the things that you look at, in the approach that you take to viewing, the way that you interact with your garden. So that's my spiel. I'm going to open it up to Q&A. I appreciate everybody for coming. If you guys need any products, humate fertilizers, top dress amendments, calcium silica amendments, microbes for cycling nutrients, microbes for pathogen suppression, have it all on the website, bokashiearthworks.net, which we will be changing the web address soon to Full Crop Science, but you don't have to worry about that, because the old one will still forward to the new one once we do it. I like to be able to come on here and provide an open chat and dialogue for everybody in the community. I think that's more important, especially with the events in the last day. Having open dialogue, asking questions, people being engaged in dialogue, regardless of what the subject matter is. So many people do so many different styles of cultivation, and the experience level is different. And so when we all come together as a community, I think it's beneficial for everybody. See if we got any questions coming in. Appreciate everybody coming in. Raindrop, Tucker, Trenscotta Garden, the OG Greg McAllister, all the people we see. Look at all the way from New Zealand. What's up, Kodo C? We got a worldwide community. Welcome. Thanks for joining. We'll keep doing more of these. I wanted to keep them kind of brief. And I think what we're going to start doing is doing better production quality, looking at different customer pain points, how we can help you guys. So you guys being engaged and giving suggestions for topics, things that you guys would like to learn that I have experience with. It makes for, I think, better viewership, better podcasts. Here we got a question from Raindrop. I've seen some bits of info you have tested using Agsil 16 as an IPM. That's a great question. So Agsil 16, I've always viewed it as a multifunctional product because you can use it as a potassium amendment in substitution of something like potassium sulfate. Let's say if you were remending soil or if you needed to add more potassium as a fertilizer into your system. The benefit is you're not only getting the potassium, but you're also getting silica, which has additional benefits. It stimulates the ethylene and jasmonic acid pathways, which stimulate acquired systemic resistance and acquired immune resistance, which can help prevent pathogens, and it can help mitigate abiotic and biotic stresses. And then as a foliar application, it has been applied, and there has been science that has been done on it suppressing pathogens on the plant's phyllosphere. And the reason why is because as an amendment alone in water, it has a very high pH. And what it does is a lot of the pathogens, they can't live at that high pH range, so it disrupts their ability to procreate and colonize new material. And also, as a foliar application, you are delivering water-soluble potassium and salicylic acid directly into the plant. So it's going to have those additional benefits as an integrated pest management product, and it's going to bring in potassium. However, you have to realize that if you are sufficient on potassium and you're not trying to bring more potassium into the system, you might opt to use a different product for your integrated pest management. So RH is up around 80%. I feel I should turn my exhaust fan up a little bit. It depends. If you're running really high temperatures, let's say you're running 85, 87 degrees, that 80% RH might still be in the proper VPD range. So you need to do a comparative analysis of how hot it is and make your adjustments based off of leaf surface temperature. Here's a question. Why don't I just sell fulvic acid? Well, we will be. The thing is, when we have the factory that we're going to build in North Dakota, we're going to be extracting the pure humic and fulvic acid, or we're going to be extracting the humic and fulvic acid from the lignite to make pure humic and fulvic acid, both agricultural, food, and pharmaceutical grade. But that process requires, a lot of technology and a lot of investment, and so we will eventually. So Sword Wielder says, I just bought some of your microbes recently, and it appears that I need a needle and a syringe to withdraw them. Actually, what you want to do is they're powdered, and so a needle and a syringe will not work. But what you want to do is you want a 100th scale, so a scale that can weigh out really small weights, and you want to weigh out on a little piece of paper. You can just tap the little vial, or you could get a small, like about 1/8 of a teaspoon scooper, and you weigh out 0.1 of a gram, and you add that to your water. You can shake it up real good and then spray it or drench it onto your media. 78 degrees is so 80% humidity and 78 degrees is too high for your RH. You would want to bring that 78 degrees up higher if you cannot reduce your relative humidity. But if you can reduce your relative humidity by, increasing the speed on your exhaust fan, if that will help, then you can do that and bring that RH down a little bit. Secta. So usually I'm just doing about a 15-minute podcast on, whatever the subject topic may be, and then opening it up to Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. You can, ask whatever you guys like. Try to keep it topic related, but, but it doesn't matter. I'm here to help you guys. You know what I mean? I've been in this space for over 2 decades. People like Greg McAllister, he's been doing it since before I was born. There's people, myself and people in the chat, who, if you guys have questions, you can, bounce those questions back. And again, Greg's an OG. If you ever heard of Northern Lights, you can thank Greg, because he's responsible for the mass distribution, getting it over to Amsterdam, and that is a huge staple in cannabis genetics. In fact, I have the Afghani bull rider that's crossed the 89 NL. John Greenbody's done a lot of work. A lot of people in the space have used it, and I wouldn't be surprised if that Northern Lights isn't responsible in some way for creating the OG Kushes and the chems and all that other stuff. I don't know for certain. We may never know, but I've grown the Northern Lights, I've grown those chems, I've grown sours. If I use a moisture meter and it goes through the roots, will that affect my plant, and what should my moisture be before watering? Well, I don't rely on moisture meters. I'm usually just relying on my own experience. If you're using something like the Blue Mat meters, I think it's anywhere between like 75 and 80 M bars. But most people won't know what that is. If I say, hey, your moisture should be in 80 M bars. But the way to tell when it comes to moisture is you could do a couple of things. You could do it by weight. So if you take a completely dry soil and you fully saturate it, that's to field capacity, that's without runoff, and you weigh it, you can subtract the difference and say, okay, well, it takes this much weight of water, find out what that water of volume is, and then that is your basically how much water it takes for field saturation. Now, you don't always want to be at field capacity. So let's say you want to be at maybe 60% of field capacity, or maybe when you're doing drybacks you want to be at 40%. You can make those adjustments based off of, the soil volume that you're using. Obviously, you need to water more frequently with smaller pots as opposed to something like beds. Also, if you're doing something like rock wool and you're doing drybacks and you're doing fertigation multiple times a day, you basically have to figure that out. And it's not just oh, you need this much water, because everybody's system and environment is different. And when you're taking a holistic approach, a drier environment, your water is going to dry. The water in the media is going to dry out faster. So that's why, taking a couple of minutes every day to look at your environment, look at your water hydrology of your media, look at your lighting levels, look at, if you're having any irregularities with your leaves, looking at, potential nutrient deficiencies or potential pathogen and pest pressure. Here's a question from Kyle Coates. Should I be mixing the trichoderma and the bacillus in the same solution to spray? Yes, absolutely. You'll get dual efficacy. So the trichoderma is a fungus, the bacillus is bacterial, but they work synergistically together and they actually improve each other's efficiency. There was a guy on Reddit asking about using MPA as a foliar spray or in a media for direct silica absorption direct to roots. People are saying they have never heard of this before. I have never heard of MPA, so it's an abbreviation for something. Maybe if I knew what the full thing was, I could tell you, but I do know that people have been using silica products for a long time in agriculture, even though it's not considered a essential nutrient. We know it has so much benefits, and that crop quality and yield can be exponentially increased by using silica products. That's why I offer the calcium silica, which is 51.3% silica, which works great with the Microbe Plus because it is converted through the microbial metabolism, that silicon, into monosalicylic and orthosalicylic acid. In the case of something like Agsil 16, it's completely soluble, and so that silica, it becomes soluble and it's converted into salicylic acid, or a form of salicylic acid like mono or orthosalicylic acid in solution, and is delivered directly to the plant. Raindrop. Oh, yeah, send them. You got the address to the office, and send them. I don't know if I'll ever be able to get to them or how long it'll take me, but I'll put them in the library. So Secta says, I'm just curious, when you ran hydro back in the day, what was your recipe that was most successful for you? So I did hydroponics for 11 years, and when I was first brought on, the system that was already in place was the 2-gallon ebb and flow brain bucket that was hooked up to a 55-gallon reservoir. So what this looks like is a plastic 2-gallon bucket with an insert. That insert is just another bucket with holes in the bottom, and you would fill that bucket up with little, it was called Hydroton, and it was essentially pelletized rock, essentially like lava rock or recycled material or whatever. And we would grow it. We would start everything in rock wool slabs. We'd have a little 4x4 in veg. We'd veg them for about 2 weeks, and then we transfer them into these these bucket systems, and they were all connected through a drip line or through a fill line, and that was connected to a brain that had a timer on it, and that brain had 2 pumps. There was one pump in the reservoir, and that pump would be plugged into the brain, and that pump would pump water into the brain, and then that would distribute to the other flood and drain tubes to water all of the different pots. And then when the fill pump, the floats would get to a certain level, it would stop filling, and then it would be on for maybe 5-10 minutes, and then it would start to fill the reservoir back up. So there was a pump inside the brain compartment, and that would pump the water back into the reservoir. And what we ran was 3-part general hydroponics with the Floralicious organic additives. So we would do the 3-2-1, or it would be 1-1-1, or it would be, depending on the phase, it would be, we would add veg, bloom, and micro. And then we add in our Floralicious, which was, I think, an amino acid, kelp additive, pH everything. And that's a system we ran that for about 11 years. But it was standard, general hydroponics. Let's see, what is the best CO2 ppm for flower? Really, I would say that if you can get around 1,000 to 1,200 is pretty adequate, but I've seen people bang out crazy yields without any CO2 at all. So I think it's really contingent on if everything is optimized already. Your environment is optimized, your light is optimized, your fertilizer or your nutrients are optimized, your genetics are optimized, your biosecurity is optimized, that you would even start considering adding additional CO2. Me personally, I don't add additional CO2, but my soil beds naturally produce CO2 from the decomposition of organic matter. So I'm constantly sitting around 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million all the time. What's the ratio when mixing lactic acid bacteria to water after you rice wash? So if you're making homemade labs, it's about 100 to 1 ratio, I do believe. Compost extracts are, I think, between 1 and 100 and 1 to 1,000, depending on crop type. Wanted to ask you if it's safe to use all of your products without worrying about range. I'm not sure. pH range? I'm not sure. If you have to elaborate a little bit more on that. Mark says, all my plants from your seeds are banging right now, indoor and outdoor. I'm glad that I actually was able to get up some seeds to you up in Canada, in that you're able to. pH range. Oh, this is a great question. Yeah, so what I recommend is watching the video, and I'll drop a link to that in this video description when I post it, on water quality. Because once you understand water quality, you're going to understand much more about pH and why pH may or may not be important when you're adding fertilizers. Harley Smith talks about using humic acid and kelp. What should I use instead of kelp? Yeah, I don't recommend kelp. I don't recommend ocean inputs, period. I completely remove them from my cultivation practices simply because high chloride, high sodium levels, and high heavy metals content. Out of the hundreds of products that I've seen tested for heavy metals, there was only one, which was Espoma, which I think had like 10 or 11 parts per million of arsenic. But all the others were in the 20s to 80 ppm of heavy metal, sodium, chloride. And so the main, argument for kelp is the phytohormones that you would be getting. Things like cytokinin, stuff like that. But you can get that from products like Microbe Plus, for instance. Those microbes produce those same things. Honestly, things like Kiaha and Yucca have a lot of those. Aloe vera probably is more beneficial than kelp. So if you wanted to substitute something, kelp as a fertilizer doesn't even make sense because the percentage of macro, secondary, and micronutrients is so low that the amount that you would need to add to any system to create sufficiency, nutritional sufficiency, it would be outrageous and logistically make no sense. But there are a lot of different products. When you're talking about the benefits that people are usually associating with kelp, which maybe I should do a podcast on kelp, why I wouldn't use it and what you could use as a replacement, those are some things that you could use. So my RO water, when I use the Micro Plus and pH went to 6.5, is that okay? It's more than okay. It's actually what you want. So when you're using the Micro Plus, right, the reason why the pH is so low is because during the fermentation process, these things are consuming organic carbohydrates and producing organic acids and enzymes, right? It drops the solution, and that's the pH range that you want those microbes to be in, right? And so it's probably, that bottle's probably sitting below 4.5, and when you added to water, it made your water drop. When you're thinking about the cycling of nutrients and how these different enzymes and organic acids work, they will bind and chelate to things. But to be able to do that, those nutrients have to be in an environment where they're actually bioavailable, where they haven't oxidized. And I'll give you an example. So iron oxidizes over 5.5 pH. So it'll typically stay in its ferric form, its divalent form, its metabolically available form in a pH range under 5.5. So when you're watering in, the solubility of those nutrients will stay unoxidized and have a greater chance of being complexed with those organic acids or those enzymes. So those things will chelate them and keep them from oxidizing when the pH is not optimal. So let's say that pH is temporary, that you're watering in, which it is from the microbes, and it in your media buffers that, and it buffers it back to 6.8. Well, the solubility of iron is not soluble at that pH range, but because it was organically complexed, when you watered in that microbe plus, it's going to stay available at that pH range because it's attached to an organic chelate, an organic molecule. And so, and it's not just iron that it does that with. It does that with manganese and copper and zinc and a lot of other elements that are metabolically available at those lower pH ranges. So you want to see those temporary pH fluctuations is actually bringing a net benefit. And the same thing can be said with when you water something in with like high potassium, right? That has a higher pH range. There are other elements like molybdenum and boron, which are have better solubility and better availability at a higher pH range. And so those small fluctuations when you're feeding things in can be beneficial for the actual uptake of certain elements. It's all about having your media buffered. That's more important, right? Having the media buffered and clean water when you start mixing whatever it is. That's the most important thing. Okay, so I Am Louisiana says, hey Brandon, I live in Louisiana and with horrible water quality. When I start my grow, I will have to use will I have to use RO water, or can you give me advice on the best plan of attack? So I would recommend you go back and watch about the podcast on water quality. Also, if you go to the Bokashi Earthworks blog, the very, very first blog that I did, you'll have to scroll all the way to the bottom, is on understanding water quality. I recommend getting a water test from Logan Labs and then reading those blogs and watching those videos, because it'll give you all the information you need to determine what you need to do based off of the data that you've collected. Three Puff Pass says those cheap moisture meters are really inaccurate, and I would agree. You need an aerometer to really get the right reading, but it's usually used as a stationary piece of equipment that you don't move around, and the aerometers can be difficult to use because they're oftentimes manual. You have to do like some pumping and calibrating and stuff like that. Yes. Is there a He wants to know if there's a table to know when to apply products. So every system's different, so we don't just have a, this is what you need to do. The humate fertilizers, if you're using a decent soil, you usually only need to use those once per cycle, like transition. So veg, you'll use the N-humate once. When you transition, you use the complex. When you're in flower, you'll use the potassium. If you've got at least a decent soil, usually one time, you can do it once every 2 weeks. You can add in intermittently once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks the Micro Plus and the calcium silica together, or you could blend them all together and do them at once. There's different ways to approach it. And the reason why we don't create just schedules is because you might go get a bag of organic Miracle Grow mix from, Walmart, and somebody else might be using Build-A-Soil. And so the amount of what you need to add to maintain nutritional sufficiency in those different soils or in those different medias are going to be different for each person. And so we have a feeding schedule that's basically for inert medias or for soils that have really low nutrient solubility, and you can use those as a base. We're currently working on the different types of scenarios. So we're going to say, hey, if you're in a full living soil, this is what we can kind of recommend. This is a base of where you should start at. If you're in inert media like cocoa, this is the program. If you're using it in DWC, or if you're using it in conjunction with chemical fertilizers, like salt base, if you're in rock wool. So we're going to create all of those. But it's not going to be, this is exact for each of these Again, anybody who says this is exactly how you have to do it, they're not thinking holistically. They're not thinking about everybody's system is a little bit different. And so you have to everybody takes a little bit different approach. But I can recommend reaching out either on IG or email and asking me for the Discord, the Full Crop Science Discord. There's all different types of people growing all different ways, and everybody is there to help each other. Content involving seeds to harvest. That's something we could do in the future, maybe. Oh no, MSA monosalicylic acid is definitely usable. Getting back to that silica, just trying to catch up on these. Crypto says, hey Brandon, I'm pretty sure I transferred some fusarium from a KY aquaponic system to my raised bed garden by using some fish water to water my bed. I used some of your bokashi to attempt to get rid of it. Yeah, the trichoderma bacillus is what I would recommend. However, if you have plants that do get infected with fusarium is systemic and it requires multiple generations of meristem tissue culture to completely clean it up. However, trichoderma is also systemic, and I have not seen any science yet about actually the internal battle. If they're both systemic, if they're both living in the xylem, will a trichoderma have the ability to outcompete and completely get rid of that fusarium or render it non-pathogenic? And that's questions for people like Kevin McKernan from Medicinal Genomics, who I'm working with currently on this leaf spot pathogen and doing some inoculations with trichoderma, the Beauveria, the bacillus, and we're doing some science. And it's just a matter that stuff all takes time, but once we have more information on that, we'll definitely keep everybody posted. But the trichoderma and bacillus subtilis is just the best combination, and I've been doing this for so long, man, and I couldn't recommend it more highly. That's why I started offering it to people, because it was something that I just had to have in my arsenal and wanted to promote it. What's up, Cali Sober? I've got some stuff for you, my buddy, that's rooted, so just DM me on IG. I'll tell you what up. Oh yeah, speaking of some things, I actually listed the Blueberry Train Mac Herbal Cut and the Blueberry Train Mac Skunk Cut on the Bokashi Seed Vault website. They're limited. I always do it limited. People absolutely love these cuts. I don't drop them a lot because I like to have a little bit of exclusivity for the next round of people to grow out and try their thing with it. And there's also some more Bicket, which is the GMO cherry pie, a couple of those. I'll be relisting the Afghani Bull Rider 89 Northern Lights. I know a bunch of people hit me up because I was out of stock. I wasn't out of stock, I just ran out of labels. So as soon as those labels come in, I'll relist that as well. Yeah, natural PGRs like cytokinins and indole-3 acetic acid. So kelp does have those, but there's a lot of other things that don't have the negative properties of kelp, like aloe vera, for instance, sprouted seed teas, for instance, even microbial ferments, for instance. They all have those same benefits as kelp without the potential for the heavy metals. Well, they could have heavy metals. It's good. Look at your COAs and all that. But without that potential of having the heavy metals that C inputs do, and then also sodium and chloride. Anyway, I appreciate you guys joining. Make sure you guys go check out the Bokashi Earthworks website. Go pick up some humate, some calcium. It helps me keep doing these things. It helps, you're supporting small business when you do so, and you're also supporting regenerative agriculture. I'm Brandon Rust. I'll see you guys Oh, do I have any more of these seeds left? No, I don't, unfortunately. I'll see you guys soon.